You are listening to the last broadcast on emergency frequency 104.7. My name is Daniel Voss. If you are hearing this signal, you have managed to reach us, and that matters. Stay with us. We are coming to you live from our secondary transmission facility in what remains of the Eastern Corridor. Primary studios are offline. We are operating on backup generator power and a satellite uplink that, as of this moment, continues to function. We want to be transparent with you about that from the very beginning. This signal could go dark. If it does, please know that we will do everything in our power to restore it. What we are covering tonight and what we expect to be covering for many days to come, is the aftermath of what historians will almost certainly designate as the Third World War. The formal exchange of hostilities between the Northern Alliance bloc, the Pan-Eastern Federation, and the Atlantic Treaty States concluded approximately 72 hours ago. The ceasefire declaration was signed in what remains of a diplomatic facility in neutral Finnish territory. But a ceasefire, as millions of people are learning right now, does not mean that the dying has stopped.
Daniel, thank you. My name is Maya Ross, and I want to say directly to everyone listening, whether you're sheltering in a basement, driving with your family on some road that you hope is still intact, or sitting in a field somewhere with a battery radio pressed to your ear, we see you. We are here with you, and we are going to tell you the truth as best we know it for as long as this signal holds. The truth right now is complicated and incomplete and in many ways devastating, but it is still the truth, and you deserve it. What we know at this hour is that the initial exchanges, which began some weeks ago, have left enormous portions of 3 continents in states of severe infrastructure collapse. We are not talking about damage in the traditional sense. We are talking about the systematic disabling of everything that a modern society requires to function: power, water, communications, transportation, medical systems. And the people caught inside all of that, the ordinary, invisible, irreplaceable people, are the story that I intend to spend every moment of this broadcast making sure you hear.
To give our listeners a factual framework for what we will be discussing over the coming hours and days, let me lay out what we understand to be the confirmed geography of impact. The most severe devastation in terms of infrastructure loss and confirmed fatalities is concentrated across 4 primary zones. Zone 1 encompasses the eastern seaboard of the former Russian Federation, running from Murmansk in the north down through St. Petersburg and into the interior as far east as the Ural Mountain Corridor. Zone 2 covers a wide band of Central Europe, including significant portions of Poland, the Czech territory, eastern Germany, and the northern Balkans. Zone 3, which received the most sustained conventional and electromagnetic strikes, spans the Korean Peninsula, the northeastern coastal provinces of China, and the island chain extending through Japan. Zone 4, and this is the one that we have the least verified information on, includes portions of the North American interior, specifically the Great Plains Corridor, running from northern Manitoba down through the Dakotas and into Kansas. We want to be absolutely clear. We are not describing nuclear exchanges in the traditional sense. The weapon systems deployed in this conflict were, in large part, a new generation of directed energy, electromagnetic pulse, and thermobaric delivery platforms. The result is not glowing craters in the traditional sense. The result is silence, dark cities, stopped infrastructure, and populations trying to survive in conditions that in some cases resemble the pre-industrial era.
And what that silence sounds like on the ground, I want our listeners to understand this, is not peaceful. We have been receiving fragmented communications from survivor networks, some via shortwave relay, some through runners who have physically carried written messages to transmission points. And what those messages describe is the sound of a modern world shutting down piece by piece, the hum of refrigeration units going silent, the moment when traffic signals go dark and cars stop moving, not because people have stopped driving, but because the fuel supply chain is broken, the sound of a hospital ward when the backup generators run out of diesel and the ventilators slow and the monitors go blank. One message, and I will read this slowly because it deserves that, came from a nurse in what we believe is the Łódź region of Poland. She wrote, "I have been on shift for 31 hours. We have no electricity. We have moved our critical patients into one room to share body heat. I am writing this by candlelight. My colleagues have not left. Not one of us has left. I don't know if anyone is coming, but I want someone to know that we are still here and we are still trying." That message was relayed to us through 3 intermediary stations. We do not know if she is still alive, but her words are alive and they will remain so.
We're approximately 3 hours into our continuous broadcast here on The Last Broadcast, and I want to begin introducing some of the structural data that our research team has been able to compile from satellite imagery, ham radio networks, and the handful of functioning news agency feeds that are still operational. The numbers we're about to discuss are preliminary. They will change. They will almost certainly get worse before they get better. But they represent our best current estimate, and they need to be said aloud. Confirmed fatalities across all theaters of conflict, as of our last verified update, stand at approximately 2.3 million individuals. That number includes direct combat casualties, civilian deaths from conventional strikes on population centers, and deaths attributable to the immediate collapse of medical infrastructure. That figure does not, and I want to stress this, does not yet account for what researchers are already calling the secondary mortality wave. The people who will die not from weapons, but from the absence of insulin, the absence of dialysis, the absence of clean water and food distribution, and the 1,000 invisible systems that keep the chronically ill and the very young and the very old alive in a functioning society. The secondary wave, by most models we've seen, is projected to dwarf the direct casualty count within 60 days.
Secondary wave, that's a technical term, and Daniel uses it correctly, but I want our listeners to sit with what that phrase actually means. It means a grandmother in Warsaw who takes a blood-thinning medication that is now sitting, untransported and expiring, in a warehouse outside Gdańsk because the trucks aren't running and the roads into the city are impassable. It means a premature infant in a neonatal unit in Seoul who needs warmth and oxygen monitoring and specialized formula, and all 3 of those things are either unavailable or running out. It means a man in a small town outside Omaha who had surgery scheduled for next week that he now cannot have because the hospital is operating on a skeleton staff with no sterile supplies and no reliable power. These are not statistics yet. They will become statistics, but right now they are people, and I think it's important that we hold that distinction for as long as we possibly can.
We have just received an update through our satellite relay from the Emergency Coordination Network operating out of Stockholm, which at this point is functioning as the de facto communications hub for what remains of coordinated European governance. I'm going to read the statement verbatim because it is important. Quote, "The Nordic Emergency Coordination Council, representing the governments of Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, and Iceland, hereby confirms that it has assumed temporary stewardship of emergency aid distribution for the Northern European corridor. We acknowledge the catastrophic disruption to governmental continuity in Poland, Germany, the Czech Republic, and the Baltic states. We are establishing forward distribution points at Gothenburg, Malmö, and Tampere. All parties seeking assistance or possessing supplies for distribution are asked to contact the Emergency Frequency Network on 7.045 megahertz shortwave." End quote. That is a carefully worded statement, and I want to parse it for our listeners. The phrase temporary stewardship and disruption to governmental continuity are diplomatic language for something starker. The governments of those Central European nations have, in practical terms, ceased to function in any coordinated way. The Polish Parliament building in Warsaw sustained direct structural liage. The German federal government relocated emergency operations 3 times in the past week, most recently to an undisclosed facility in Bavaria. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, we have almost no information about, and that absence of information is itself deeply alarming.
I want to bring in a voice here because we've been doing that throughout this broadcast, and I think it's essential. We received this message approximately 40 minutes ago via the amateur radio relay out of northern Sweden. The sender identifies himself only as Tomasz, and he says he is in a village east of Krakow. He says, I am recording this on a battery recorder and giving it to a cyclist who says he will try to reach the relay point. My village has about 400 people. We have not seen any official presence, military, government aid, in 9 days. We have organized ourselves. We have a food committee. We have a medical tent run by a retired doctor and 2 nursing students. We have a watch rotation at night. We are not panicking. We are taking care of each other, but we need people to know where we are. Our coordinates are... And then he reads a set of coordinates that we are passing to the Stockholm network. What strikes me about Tomasz is not his fear, it's his organizational calm. It's the fact that his first instinct, and the instinct of 400 strangers bound by proximity, was to form a committee. That pattern, the spontaneous emergence of local governance structures in the absence of central authority, is being documented across multiple collapse zones. It is one of the more statistically consistent behavioral signatures in post-disruption environments, and it matters because it speaks to resilience infrastructure that exists independent of the state. We are seeing it in rural Poland, in the countryside outside Nagoya, in farming communities, in the Dakotas. People organize, they do it imperfectly and sometimes with conflict, but they do it.
We are now about 6 hours into our continuous coverage. I want to update the confirmed casualty figure, which has been revised upward by our research team based on new satellite data from the Korean Peninsula Theater. The revised figure stands at 2.9 million confirmed dead. The Korean Peninsula, I should say to our listeners who may need geographic context, was effectively the most concentrated theater of kinetic exchange in the entire conflict. Seoul sustained multiple strikes over a period of 4 days. Pyongyang, which had been largely evacuated prior to the exchange, apparently North Korean military leadership had significant advance warning, sustained a different kind of damage. We are still trying to understand the full scope of what happened there.
South Korea is a country I want to spend some time on because I think it tends to disappear in the broader geopolitical framing. South Korea was a nation of 52 million people. It was one of the most technologically advanced, densely connected, economically vibrant societies on Earth. Within the space of 4 days, its capital city was rendered largely uninhabitable, not destroyed in a cinematic sense. The buildings still stand in many areas, but without power, without water pressure, without functioning transit, without hospitals, without communication, 52 million people were reduced to asking a very basic question: where do I go and how do I get there? We have received reports of a mass movement south toward Busan, which sustained less damage and whose port facilities, while heavily damaged, are at least partially functional. Reports describe a column of people on foot, on bicycle, in vehicles that eventually run out of fuel and are abandoned, children, elderly people in wheelchairs being pushed by their grandchildren, people carrying their entire lives in backpacks, and moving through them periodically, military convoys doing what they can to maintain order and distribute emergency rations, but completely overwhelmed by the scale of what they're dealing with.
The situation in Japan, which we should address directly, is distinct from South Korea in some important ways. Japan did not sustain the same concentration of direct strikes that the Korean Peninsula did. What Japan sustained was an electromagnetic pulse cascade that effectively destroyed the electronic infrastructure of the majority of Honshu Island and significant portions of Kyushu and Hokkaido. Japan's extraordinary sophistication as a technological society, the very thing that made it one of the most functional nations on Earth, became a vulnerability in this context. When you have a society whose food distribution, healthcare coordination, financial systems, and transportation are all deeply integrated with electronic infrastructure. An EMP event doesn't just disrupt daily life, it removes the skeleton from a body that didn't know it had one. The Japanese government's response has been, by all accounts we can access, remarkably organized relative to the chaos around it. Emperor and government statements were delivered via surviving radio transmitters within hours of the pulse event. Civil defense protocols, which Japan maintains at an exceptionally high level given its seismic history, were activated immediately. The self-defense forces were deployed with pre-positioned supplies, and yet the scale, 125 million people on an island chain with disrupted supply lines, is simply staggering to contemplate.
We have now been on air for approximately 9 hours. I want to say something directly to people who might be listening and wondering why we keep broadcasting, why we keep detailing things that are painful to hear. I want to say it because I've been thinking about it. Information, accurate and honest information, is one of the most practical survival resources that exists. In a crisis, rumor fills the vacuum where information should be, and rumor kills people. It sends them in the wrong direction. It causes them to mistrust the people who are trying to help them. It turns neighbor against neighbor. What we are doing here, what you are helping us do by staying tuned, is hold back the dark with words. We are doing journalism, old, slow, careful journalism, and I believe it matters.
We have just received a communication through the Stockholm Relay that appears to be an official statement from what is described as the Emergency Governing Council of the Atlantic Treaty States. This is the multinational body formed from the remnant governmental structures of the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and the Western European nations not under active disruption. I will read the relevant portion. Quote, "The Emergency Governing Council confirms that the Atlantic Treaty States remain committed to the Reykjavik ceasefire agreement. All offensive operations have been suspended. We acknowledge the ongoing humanitarian catastrophe across multiple theaters and commit the following resources. 15 naval vessels currently configured for aid delivery are en route to staging areas in the North Sea and Pacific. Emergency food stocks from pre-positioned depots in Iceland, the Azores, and Hawaii are being mobilized. All civilian flights in safe airspace are being organized under military coordination for emergency resupply." End quote. The significance of that statement is multi-layered. The phrase "in safe airspace" is doing a great deal of work there. It implies that not all airspace is safe, which means that whatever air defense systems are still active and not under ceasefire compliance are a continuing danger to relief operations. We don't know precisely which systems those are. We are working on that.
It's been about 12 hours now since we began broadcasting, and I want to take stock of where we are emotionally as much as informationally, because 12 hours is long enough for the initial numbness to begin wearing off and for something else to set in. For a lot of people listening, that something else is grief, and I don't mean abstract grief for the idea of civilization, though that's real too. I mean the concrete bodily grief of not knowing whether someone you love is alive. We have been reading out messages from listeners, and I want to continue doing that. This one came through shortwave relay from someone who signs their message as a father in Alberta, Canada. He writes, "My daughter was studying in Berlin when it started. I have heard nothing for 11 days. I don't know if she made it. I don't know if anyone in her building made it. Her name is Sophie, and she is 23 years old, and she studies architecture, and she is afraid of spiders, and she laughs like her mother did. I am asking anyone who was in the Prenzlauer Berg neighborhood of Berlin and made it out to please contact the relay frequency if you have any information." His name is Robert, and he has given a shortwave contact address. Robert, we are reading your message to everyone who can hear us. And Sophie, if by any chance you are near a radio and you can hear this, your father is in Alberta and he is listening for you.
I want to speak to what has happened in China's northeastern coastal provinces, because this is a theater that has received relatively limited coverage compared to the European and Korean situations, and it represents a staggering human reality. The provinces of Liaoning, Jilin, and Heilongjiang, combined with the coastal regions of Shandong. This is a region of approximately 230 million people. The infrastructure disruption there has been severe. The communication blackout has been nearly total. What we know comes primarily from fishing vessel radio communications, satellite thermal imaging interpretation, and a handful of ham radio operators who are operating pre-collapse and have managed to maintain intermittent contact. What the satellite imaging suggests is massive population movement inland, away from the coastal zones that were primary strike targets, toward interior regions with more agricultural capacity and presumably better survival conditions. The scale of that movement, we're talking about something potentially comparable to the largest migrations in human history, is almost impossible to model from our current vantage point. What we do know is that the Chinese central government's emergency broadcast system has been operational on and off, and the messages it has been transmitting are consistent with an activated national emergency protocol involving military distribution of food and water in interior provinces.
The day is turning, and it is now what I'm estimating is somewhere around the 14-hour mark of our broadcast. I want to address something that our listeners have been asking about in their messages: radiation. A number of people have asked whether the weapon systems used in this conflict created radioactive contamination and whether they need to be concerned about that specifically. Daniel, I know you've been consulting with some of the technical material we've received.
This is an important question, and I want to answer it carefully and honestly. The consensus from the technical documentation we've been able to access is this: the primary weapons deployed in this conflict were not nuclear in the traditional sense. The electromagnetic pulse devices, the directed energy platforms, the thermobaric weapons, these do not produce radioactive fallout in the way that fission or fusion detonations do. However, there are two caveats that listeners need to understand. The first is that several of the strikes on military-industrial facilities, particularly in the eastern Russian theater and in certain coastal Chinese industrial zones, hit facilities that themselves contained radioactive materials: nuclear power plants, research facilities, weapons storage sites. The secondary contamination from those facility strikes is real and is being tracked. The second caveat is simpler. We don't know everything. We are not able to confirm with absolute certainty the nature of every weapon used in every engagement. We are advising extreme caution in the specific zones we can identify and general caution everywhere else.
That's a real and important answer, and I think what listeners should take from it is, if you are in one of the impact zones, please stay tuned for the specific contamination advisories that the Stockholm Network and the Atlantic Treaty Council are beginning to issue. We will relay those as they come in. If you are in a region that did not sustain direct strikes, your primary concern right now is not radiation. It is the collapse of supply chains and the secondary effects we've been discussing.
We're now well into our first full day of broadcasting. I want to do a geographic accounting of what we understand to be the functional status of nations and regions as of this hour. I'll go region by region. In Scandinavia and Iceland, these nations are functioning, damaged, stressed, overwhelmed by the influx of refugees from the south and east, but functioning. Their governments are intact and operational. In Western Europe, specifically, Portugal, Spain, France, Switzerland, and Ireland, these nations are operating in degraded but functional states. Emergency measures are active. Supply disruptions are significant, but central government authority is maintained. Italy sustained some peripheral strikes on its northeastern infrastructure and is managing in crisis mode. Moving east, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and the Baltic states are in states of severe governmental disruption. We are seeing the emergence of the local governance structures Maya has been describing, but central authority is effectively absent. Germany is a divided picture. The western and southern regions are managing under Bavarian-based emergency government, while the eastern and northern regions are in various states of infrastructure collapse. The Netherlands and Belgium are functioning but straining under massive refugee inflows from the east.
I want to hold on one of those words for a moment, refugee, because it's a word that can slide past us, and I don't want it to. Refugees are people in motion. They are people who have made the calculation that where they are is more dangerous than the unknown of somewhere else. I want to tell you about a specific moment that was described to us in a message from a Dutch Red Cross volunteer working at a reception point outside Utrecht. She writes, "Yesterday, a bus arrived. It had been driving from somewhere in eastern Germany, 74 people inside. A man got off the bus, and the first thing he did was look up at the sky. Just looked at the sky. For a long time, I asked him through a translator what he was looking for. He said, 'Nothing. I just wanted to look at the sky without being afraid of it.' That moment, that simple, shattering moment of a man looking at the sky. We are receiving more and more messages like that one, people describing not the dramatic moments of the crisis, or not the sounds or the light or the immediate fear, but the small things, the texture of survival. A message from a woman in rural Kyushu, relayed through the Japanese Self-Defense Forces Emergency Communication Network, describes walking 2 hours each morning to a clean water distribution point. She says the thing that surprises her is how quiet the walk is. No traffic, no machinery, just birds and wind and the sound of her own feet. She says she has started naming the birds she sees on the walk. She has gotten very good at bird identification. She says she thinks about that as about knowing the names of things as a way of holding on to the idea that the world still has names, still has categories, still has an order underneath the chaos.
It has now been approximately 24 hours since we first went to air. We have been on continuously for one full day, and I want to give our listeners the clearest picture I can of where things stand at this marker. Confirmed global fatalities have been revised to approximately 4.1 million. That upward revision reflects primarily the processing of casualty reports from the Korean Peninsula that were delayed due to communication disruption, and new data on infrastructure-related deaths, hospital failures, exposure, water supply contamination events in the Polish and Eastern German zones. The ceasefire, I should note, has held. There have been no new confirmed offensive actions by any of the primary belligerents in the past 41 hours. This is significant. The concern among analysts was that the ceasefire would unravel as ground-level commanders lost contact with Central Command and acted independently. That has not happened to any verified large-scale degree, though there are reports of localized armed incidents in the Korean DMZ area and along the Russian-Finnish border that we cannot yet classify as ceasefire violations with confidence.
We've been receiving a stream of listener messages throughout the night, and I do want to note that several of our relay operators have been awake and working for a very long time to keep this network alive, and I am grateful to all of them. One relay station in northern Norway has been up for over 20 hours continuously. The operator, who identified himself only as Lars from Tromsø, sent us a brief note that said, I will keep the relay open as long as the generator holds. Tell people to keep listening. They need to keep listening. Lars, we are telling them, they are listening. This message arrived through the Pacific Relay Network and appears to come from somewhere in the Hawaiian Islands, which we understand to be functioning as the main Pacific coordination hub for the Atlantic Treaty Council relief operations. A medical officer writes, we are seeing a consistent pattern at the triage stations in the Pacific Theater. The people who arrive in the best condition are not always the young and physically strong. The people who arrive in the best condition are most often the ones who arrived in groups, extended families, neighborhood clusters, people who refused to split up. There is data developing here about social cohesion as a survival variable that I think will change how we think about emergency preparedness permanently. I find that observation remarkable. Cohesion as survival technology.
I want to spend some time on the situation in North America, which our coverage has touched on but not examined in sufficient depth. The Great Plains Corridor disruption, the Zone 4 I described in our opening hour, is a unique situation. The electromagnetic pulse events in that region were less about targeting population centers, which are sparse, and more about targeting the infrastructure spine of North American agriculture and energy distribution. The oil pipelines, the grain storage facilities, the electrical transmission grid that serves the central continent. What that means practically is that a region with relatively low population density has sustained extremely high infrastructure damage, and the cascading effects of that are only beginning to be understood. The Central Plains produce a significant fraction of global grain supply. If the disruption to storage, processing, and distribution infrastructure persists for more than one growing season, and at current projections, there is serious concern that it will. The knock-on effects for global food security extend far beyond North America. We are talking about potential food shortages affecting populations in Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia that have absolutely no direct connection to the conflict itself.
That connection, the way this crisis reaches into the lives of people who were not combatants, who were not near a strike zone, who were simply dependent on the interconnected systems that a global economy creates, I think that might be one of the things that this period of history will ultimately be understood as being about. The invisibility of interconnection. We built a world of profound and intricate interdependence, and we didn't fully account for what happens when parts of that web are torn. I want to read a message that arrived through our shortwave network from someone identifying themselves as a teacher in Lagos, Nigeria. This person is physically far from any conflict zone. Their city has not been struck. Their government is intact. But they write, well, we are watching the food prices every day. There is a number on the chalkboard in our market, and every day the number changes, and everyone who walks past it stops and looks at it and knows we are not in the war, but the war is in us now. We are calculating. That teacher in Lagos is describing something that will be replicated in every major city of the developing world over the coming months. The arithmetic of scarcity.
We are now, by our reckoning, approximately 36 hours into continuous broadcast. I want to report some genuinely significant developments that have come through the Stockholm network in the past 2 hours. The first is that the United Nations emergency session, convened in its backup facility in Geneva, the New York headquarters is under a communications blackout as part of the disruption to North American infrastructure, has passed a unanimous resolution designating this crisis a planetary emergency event, the first time that classification has been used in the organization's history. The implications of that classification are primarily logistical and legal. It triggers the activation of every member nation's mandatory emergency contribution protocols. It removes certain trade and shipping restrictions that would otherwise impede the movement of relief supplies. And it activates the Emergency Global Food Reserve System, which has stockpiles in 6 geographically distributed locations around the world. None of that resolves the crisis, but it removes barriers to resolution, which matters.
The second development I want to report, and Daniel, I know you were just working on this, is the first confirmed large-scale successful aid delivery in the Korean Peninsula Theater. 3 vessels from what is being described as a joint Japanese-Australian-New Zealand relief flotilla reached the port of Busan approximately 4 hours ago. They are unloading supplies as we speak: food, water purification equipment, medical supplies, and this detail is important and human, communications equipment, including satellite phones and battery-powered radios. Because radios matter. I say that not self-referentially, but as a factual statement about disaster response. The ability of people in a disrupted zone to receive information is itself a life-saving intervention. It tells them where the water is, it tells them which roads are passable, it tells them when the next supply drop is coming, it tells them they are not forgotten. 3 ships reached Busan Harbor today, and on those ships there were radios, and that is a genuinely meaningful development.
We are getting a picture emerging from multiple sources about what happened in the days before the ceasefire that I think is important to report now that we have some distance from the immediate crisis moment. The cascade of events that led to the formal exchange of hostilities was apparently faster and more uncontrolled than any of the major parties intended. The conflict began, by most accounts, with a series of cyber infrastructure attacks on financial and energy systems in Eastern Europe. Those attacks were responded to with what was framed as defensive countermeasures that themselves caused cascading infrastructure failures. And within a period of approximately 11 days, a crisis that began with digital disruption had escalated through a series of misinterpretations, broken communication channels, and individual command decisions made without full situational awareness into a kinetic conflict on multiple continents. The word that keeps appearing in the analyses we've seen is speed. The speed of escalation outpaced the diplomatic mechanisms that existed to contain it. There were conversations happening, there were hotlines in use, but the events on the ground were moving faster than the conversations, and by the time a genuine de-escalation framework was agreed upon, significant damage had already been done across every contested theater.
The word miscalculation has appeared in 3 of the 4 governmental statements we've received, and I want to sit with that for a moment because it strikes me as both technically accurate and morally insufficient. When 4.1 million people are dead, and that number is going to rise substantially, miscalculation is a word that barely contains what it's describing. Each of those 4.1 million people was the center of a world, had people who loved them, had things they were going to do. I don't say this to assign blame right now. The investigation into decisions and decision makers is a task for the years ahead, and it is a task that must be done. I say it because the gap between the scale of the event and the language we use to describe it is itself a kind of honesty failure, and I think honesty is what we owe each other right now.
As we cross the 48-hour mark of our broadcast, I want to do a comprehensive situational update. Global fatalities confirmed, 4.7 million. That number continues to climb primarily due to delayed reporting from the Eastern Russian and Korean theaters. The ceasefire has now held for 63 hours. Aid deliveries have reached the port of Busan in South Korea, multiple locations on Japan's Pacific coast, 2 refugee staging areas in Poland near the Czech border, and 3 locations in eastern Germany. Power restoration has begun in limited areas. Parts of western Poland are reporting restored electrical service, as are portions of Hokkaido in northern Japan. On the negative side of the ledger, the Bratislava Dam complex in Slovakia has sustained structural damage that engineers on site are describing as critical. A dam failure there would have cascading consequences for the Danube River basin, affecting populations in Austria, Hungary, Croatia, and Serbia. This is being treated as a priority emergency. Austrian military engineers have been deployed to assist.
The Bratislava situation is one of those places where the original conflict and the secondary crisis intersect in a way that illustrates what I keep calling the cascading nature of this event. The dam didn't sustain a direct strike. It sustained damage from ground vibration caused by strikes on an industrial facility 12 kilometers away. And now the potential downstream, literally and figuratively, consequences of that vibration could affect millions of people who were already managing in an extraordinarily difficult situation. I want to spend some time on the refugee corridor that has formed across Central Europe. By the estimates coming through the Stockholm network, somewhere between 8 and 12 million people are currently in motion across the European continent. That's a number that I find genuinely difficult to hold in the mind all at once, so let me try to make it concrete. The main refugee column moving west from Poland and eastern Germany into the Netherlands, Belgium, and France is estimated at approximately 3 million people. They are moving along road networks that are partially functional, serviced by a patchwork of civilian volunteers, religious organizations, military convoys, and emergency responders who are themselves exhausted and undersupplied. We received a message from someone working at a rest station on the E45 highway near the German-Dutch border. She says, "We have been handing out soup for 4 days. We ran out of spoons on the second day. People are drinking directly from the cups. Nobody complains. There was a family yesterday, 2 parents, 4 children, a grandmother in a wheelchair. They had been walking for 8 days. The father sat down at one of our tables and put his face in his hands and sat like that for 10 minutes. None of us disturbed him. When he lifted his head, he said, 'Thank you for the soup.' And then he helped us carry crates."
We have been broadcasting for approximately 72 hours, 3 full days. We have not had continuous personnel throughout. Our team has rotated, but this signal has been live and continuous for that entire period. I want to give some updated structural analysis now, because we have more data than we did 72 hours ago, and the picture it paints has some new elements. The situation in the Eastern Russian theater has become somewhat clearer. The areas of most severe disruption appear to be concentrated in the St. Petersburg and Murmansk regions, with significant but less total infrastructure loss extending south toward Moscow. The Russian Federation government, operating from a hardened facility that we understand to be in the Ural region, has been broadcasting in Russian via shortwave with consistent messaging about maintaining order and the deployment of military resources to affected civilian zones. whatever the political complexities of the Russian state's role in the events that led here. The practical response to the civilian crisis appears to be functioning. Moscow itself presents an interesting case. The city's infrastructure was less severely disrupted than St. Petersburg's, and there are reports of large-scale civilian self-organization in the city that go beyond anything officially directed. Residents of Moscow's dense apartment blocks appear to have established neighborhood coordination committees that are managing food and water distribution within individual buildings and blocks. Reports describe community kitchens which operating in courtyards, communal heating systems rigged from available materials, and informal networks for locating missing persons. It is, in its way, an extraordinary example of urban resilience.
I think cities are interesting in this crisis. There's been a narrative, and I've heard it in some of the messages we've received, that cities are inherently vulnerable and that rural areas are where resilience lives. And there's some truth to that. Access to land, to agricultural resources, to wood for heat, to well water, these things matter and they are concentrated outside cities. But the counter story, which Moscow seems to be offering, and which we've seen hints of in Seoul and in Tokyo and in Warsaw, is that dense urban populations have something that sparse rural areas don't: immediate proximity to other people. And other people are a resource. A message we received from a resident of a high-rise block in the Mokoto district of Warsaw. She writes, "Our building has 18 floors and perhaps 200 apartments. By the third day, the lower floors had moved everyone elderly and young up to the middle floors for heat conservation. The building has a generator on the roof that powers one light per floor, enough to see. We have a farmer on the 8th floor, retired, who knows which wild plants are edible and which are not. We have a physician on the 12th floor. We have a musician on the 2nd floor who plays every evening at 7 o'clock exactly, and every floor opens their doors and listens. His name is Woschek. I don't know his last name. I have heard him play violin every evening for 2 weeks, and I don't know his last name, but I know his music, and I know that when it starts, my breathing slows."
It is now approximately 5 days into our continuous coverage. The casualty figure has crossed a threshold that I find profoundly difficult to report, and I want to report it carefully. Confirmed deaths across all cause categories: direct conflict casualties, infrastructure-related deaths, medical system failures, displacement-related mortality, and confirmed contamination events from secondary industrial site damage now stand at approximately 7,200,000. That number has been growing at a rate of roughly 250,000 per day over the past 48 hours, a rate that reflects the secondary mortality wave we identified early in our coverage beginning to materialize. The contamination zones I want to be specific about. 3 nuclear power plant facilities sustained secondary damage during the conflict: the Leningrad nuclear power plant near St. Petersburg, the Kori nuclear power plant in South Korea, and 1 facility in China's coastal zone, Husum, whose identity we have not been able to confirm with certainty. Exclusion zones have been established around all 3. The radius of required evacuation around the Leningrad facility is the most significant. We are talking about a zone encompassing an area with a pre-conflict population of approximately 1.2 million people.
The word exclusion zone will be familiar to many of our listeners who know the history of Chernobyl and Fukushima. It's a bureaucratic term that contains an enormous human weight. An exclusion zone means you cannot go back. Not today. Maybe not this decade. Maybe, in the worst cases, not in any of our lifetimes. When we say 1.2 million people are within the Leningrad exclusion zone, what we are saying is that 1.2 million people, many of whom have already lost everything else, are also now being told they cannot go home. That the place that was home is not home anymore and may not be again. The psychological dimension of that, the way that place functions as identity and memory and continuity, the way that losing a home is different from losing a house, I think we will be reckoning with that for generations. There is a word in Welsh, hireth, that describes a kind of longing for a home that no longer exists, or perhaps never existed in the way you remember it. We don't have a good English equivalent. After this, we may need one.
I want to report a significant development on the aid and recovery front that came through the Stockholm Relay about 2 hours ago. The Atlantic Treaty Council has announced the formal activation of what it is calling Operation Rebuild Forward, a multi-phase infrastructure restoration program for the most severely disrupted European zones. The first phase focuses on 3 specific priorities: restoration of water treatment and distribution infrastructure, restoration of hospital capacity, and restoration of communications networks. It does not yet address electrical generation or transportation infrastructure, which are considered second phase priorities. The reason for that sequencing is important and makes medical sense. Clean water and functional hospital systems will prevent deaths in the near term more efficiently than restored electrical power. A generator providing power to a hospital saves more lives than the same generator powering a neighborhood's lights. The triage logic of the recovery, in other words, is as critical as the triage logic of emergency medicine.
It has been approximately 1 week, 7 days of continuous broadcasting with a rotating team. I want to take stock of where we are in human terms in addition to the statistical and operational picture. We have been receiving messages from around the world throughout this period, and certain themes have emerged that I want to share. The first theme is what I would call the discovery of neighbors. Message after message from Warsaw and from Tokyo and from Seoul and from rural Saskatchewan and from a village in eastern Germany describes the same phenomenon. People who had lived in proximity for years and never spoken properly, now depending on each other for survival and discovering each other as full human beings in the process. A woman in Sapporo, Japan, writes that she has lived in her apartment building for 12 years and knew none of her neighbors. Now she knows all of them. She knows who has medications that need to be shared. She knows who has the skills that the community needs. She knows who plays guitar. She says, "I think I have lived in this building properly for the last 8 days."
The second theme in the messages, and this one is harder, is loss. Pure, structural, unmistakable loss. People reporting the deaths of family members, people reporting the destruction of their homes and businesses and communities, people who cannot find missing persons and are beginning with terrible clarity to understand why. The casualty figure, now revised to approximately 8,600,000 as of our latest update, represents that magnitude of loss in aggregate. But aggregates don't grieve, aggregates don't lie awake. Only people do those things. The Bratislava Dam situation I mentioned earlier has resolved. I want to give our listeners the update. Austrian and Slovak engineering teams working around the clock for approximately 90 hours managed to implement emergency stabilization measures that the Stockholm Engineering Network assessed as sufficient to prevent catastrophic failure. The Danube Basin will not flood. This is a genuine victory of competence and international cooperation under extraordinary pressure, and I think it deserves to be named as such.
It does. I have been thinking about the people who worked on that dam for 90 hours, engineers who drove through disrupted roads to get there, who worked by headlamp when the power failed, who made calculations that they knew millions of people were depending on. We don't know their names, we may never know their names, but what they did, that specific, skilled, quiet act of preventing an additional catastrophe is as meaningful as any dramatic moment in this crisis. That's a theme I want to hold on to as we continue into the second week of coverage. The quiet acts, the nurse who stayed, the cyclist who carried the message, the relay operator in Tromsø who kept the generator running, the engineer on the dam, the man carrying soup crates. History will record this period in terms of military exchanges and diplomatic frameworks and casualty statistics, but the actual substance of human experience during this time is made of those quiet acts, and I don't want to let them disappear into the larger narrative.
We are now at the 2-week mark. 14 days of continuous coverage. I want to do a comprehensive status review for our listeners. Global confirmed fatalities now stand at approximately 12 million. The rate of new deaths has begun to slow from approximately 250,000 per day in the first week to approximately 120,000 per day in the second week. That slowing reflects the impact of aid deliveries, restored water infrastructure in some zones, and medical capacity restoration. It is progress. It is not nearly enough progress, but it is progress. By region, Japan is stabilizing. The self-defense forces and the International Relief Flotilla have managed to establish functioning distribution networks covering approximately 60% of Honshu's population. Power is being restored in sections. The communications blackout is lifting. South Korea remains in severe distress. Busan is functioning as an improvised capital and logistics hub. Seoul is being assessed for re-entry. The preliminary assessment is that approximately 40% of the city's structures are safe for re-entry, and a phased return program is being planned. The Korean Peninsula death toll, now including both North and South Korea, stands at approximately 2,300,000.
The situation in Eastern Russia and in Central Europe is what I want to spend some time on, because these are the zones that have the longest road ahead of them. And I think they're in danger of disappearing from the broader narrative as other situations reach stages of visible improvement. In Eastern Russia, the humanitarian situation is severe and is expected to remain severe through the winter months. The infrastructure disruption coincided with the approach of the Russian winter, which in the St. Petersburg and Murmansk regions is a genuine survival variable. The Russian Federation government, to its credit, has prioritized heating fuel distribution at the expense of other logistics. But reports from the ham radio networks in those regions describe populations that are cold, undersupplied, and this is important, very, very far from any international aid distribution point. A message that arrived yesterday from someone near Pskov, Russia, identified only as a teacher. He writes, "We have wood, we have canned food from before. We have about 60 people in our village who are old enough to remember the Soviet system. And they know things about living without conveniences that my generation never had to learn. They are teaching us now. There is a woman here who is 81 years old, and she remembers the siege of Leningrad as a child. She doesn't talk about it very often, but every day she gets up at 5:30 in the morning, and she does the things that need to be done. She is the reason our village is going to survive the winter."
As we approach the 3-week mark, I want to report on some developments that represent what I would characterize as the beginning of a new phase in the global response. The United Nations Planetary Emergency Framework has now resulted in the activation of emergency food stocks from the 6 global distribution points I mentioned earlier. Ships have departed from depots in Australia, Brazil, South Africa, and Canada carrying emergency food aid to staging points in the North Sea, the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean for onward distribution. Simultaneously, the global telecommunications consortiums that manage satellite internet infrastructure have completed an emergency protocol that prioritizes bandwidth in disrupted zones for emergency services and humanitarian coordination. This is practically significant because it means that even in areas where physical infrastructure is destroyed, satellite-enabled communications are becoming available for coordination purposes. It doesn't restore the internet for ordinary citizens, but it restores the communications backbone for relief operations, which is what's needed at this stage.
I want to report on the children. I have been wanting to do this for days, and I think we are now at a point where we have enough information to speak meaningfully about what is happening with children in the disrupted zones. By the most recent UNICEF emergency estimate relayed through the Stockholm network, approximately 40 million children are currently in what is classified as acute humanitarian need. That category includes food insecurity, displacement, loss of caregiver, and exposure to trauma. Among that number, approximately 3 million children are classified as unaccompanied, meaning they are, to the best of anyone's knowledge, without a parent, guardian, or known family member. That number is one of the most difficult facts of this crisis to hold. 3 million children somewhere in this disrupted world navigating survival without an adult who knows their name. The response to that specific situation has been significant. There are networks operating throughout the European refugee corridor, in the Korean peninsula, in Japan, and in other zones specifically focused on identifying, documenting, and caring for unaccompanied children. A volunteer coordinator we heard from via the Stockholm Network describes them as the most organized people in any camp anywhere. The children, they adapt faster than adults, they learn the rules of a new place faster, they find the other children, and they form groups, and they take care of each other in ways that would astonish you. She pauses in her message, and then she says, "It should astonish you, but it should also break your heart a little, because they shouldn't have to."
It is now approximately 25 days into our continuous coverage. The casualty figure, which has been climbing throughout, has now reached what our analysts believe is close to its peak rate, though the absolute number will continue to rise as secondary mortality continues to accumulate. The current confirmed total is 17,200,000. Our analysts project that the final confirmed toll, when all secondary mortality from medical system failure, exposure, starvation, and contamination is fully accounted for, will land between 21 and 25 million over a period of approximately 90 days from the start of hostilities. I want to be honest with our listeners that this number, 21 to 25 million, is a number that places this event in the category of the most lethal episodes in human history. The Second World War killed approximately 70 to 85 million people over 6 years. The Spanish flu of 1918 killed an estimated 50 million. What we are describing here, concentrated into a much shorter period and affecting a globally connected world in ways those prior catastrophes did not, is an event of that historical register. I say that not to paralyze our listeners, but because honesty is the only adequate response to what has happened.
And alongside that honesty, I want to offer what I believe is also true. The world endures. I have been in this broadcast for 25 days, and I have reported deaths and disasters and collapse on a scale I would not have believed possible before this began. And in the same 25 days, I have read you the words of a nurse in Poland who did not leave her patients, a man in Moscow who rigged a communal heating system, an 81-year-old woman in Pskov who gets up at 5:30 every morning, engineers who saved the Bratislava Dam, volunteers who handed out soup until they ran out of spoons and then handed it out anyway. I have read you messages from 40 countries, from places that were struck and places that were not struck but are rippling with the effects. And in all of them, in every single one, there are people doing what human beings do, which is persist, organize, help each other, mourn, and then move. That is not a small thing. In a time when almost everything seems to have gotten smaller, smaller prospects, smaller certainty, smaller faith in the structures we thought would hold, the human impulse to persist and help is getting larger. I have watched it get larger over 25 days, and I believe in it.
We are now at the 30-day mark, 1 full month since the first reports of hostilities reached this network. I want to give our listeners the definitive situational assessment that we have been building toward throughout this broadcast. The cause of this conflict, as determined by the preliminary analysis now formally published by the UN Emergency Fact-Finding Commission operating out of Geneva, was a cascading misinterpretation event initiated by a coordinated cyber attack of disputed origin on financial and energy infrastructure in Poland and the Baltic states in the 3rd week of the conflict's preliminary phase. The cyber attack triggered automatic defensive responses in multiple national and alliance-level systems. Those defensive responses were interpreted by opposing systems as offensive escalatory actions. A chain of automated and semi-automated defensive and retaliatory measures then unfolded at a speed that outpaced human decision-making at every critical juncture. The Commission's preliminary language is stark. No individual actor made a decision to start a world war. The World War was initiated by the interaction of automated systems operating at speeds beyond human oversight, each responding defensively to the last action of the other. This will be the central fact that historians and policy analysts must reckon with, not that leaders chose catastrophe, but that the systems built to prevent catastrophe, running faster than human judgment could follow, produced it anyway.
That finding from the Commission is one of the most important things said aloud in the past 30 days. Not because it absolves anyone, The decisions to build and deploy those automated systems were human decisions made over decades by identifiable people with names. But because it tells us something specific about what must change, the architecture of how nations manage crises and respond to perceived threats must change. The speed must be brought back into alignment with human decision-making capacity. That is the specific lesson. It is a technical and political lesson as much as a moral one. But I want to end our coverage, and I think we are approaching an ending, not because the crisis is over, but because we have now told its first chapter as completely as we can. I want to end by accounting for what remains.
What remains? Let me give that accounting as clearly as I can. The ceasefire has held for 27 days. There have been no new offensive actions by any party. The political map of the world has changed in several specific and significant ways. The Korean Peninsula is now under a joint emergency administration framework co-managed by South Korea's surviving government structure, the UN Emergency Council, and a Japanese-Australian-New Zealand relief consortium. North Korea, as a functional state entity, does not exist. Its military command structure dissolved during the conflict. Its population, estimated at roughly 25 million people, is now in a state of profound humanitarian crisis being addressed by the joint framework. In eastern Russia, the Murmansk and St. Petersburg regions are operating under a combination of Federal Russian Emergency Administration and international humanitarian coordination. The exclusion zone around the Leningrad nuclear power plant is expected to remain in effect for a minimum of 30 years. The population of that zone, 1.2 million people, are now formally classified as permanently displaced. Russia as a state entity has survived, but a significant fraction of its northwestern population has been permanently removed from its homeland. In Central Europe, the most severely disrupted nations, Poland, the Czech Republic, and the Baltic states, are operating under emergency European administration. With the support of the Nordic Emergency Council and the Western European governments, the international community has committed to a multi-year reconstruction program. Poland and the Czech Republic will recover. The question of timeline, of how many years, of what they recover into, those questions are open. The Baltic states are in a more complex situation. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania each sustained levels of infrastructure destruction that their relatively small population bases and limited remaining resources make particularly difficult to overcome without sustained external support.
The final global confirmed death toll, as of our last verified update, and let me say this word so that our listeners can hold it, is 22,400,000 people. That is a number that represents lives, families, futures, stories. It is the largest loss of human life in a single event in the modern era. It will be the number that defines this time in history, and it will be the number that every person alive today will carry for the rest of their lives, whether they were directly affected or not. 22,400,000. Say it slowly and feel what it means.
And yet what remains is this. Approximately 8 billion people are alive. The majority of the world's nations are functioning. The aid networks that formed in the chaos of the first days have solidified into operational frameworks that are genuinely saving lives. The secondary mortality wave, which was projected to be as high as 10 million, appears to be tracking toward a lower figure due to the speed and scale of the international humanitarian response, a response that had failures and delays and was never remotely adequate, but was also unprecedented in its scope. The Reykjavik ceasefire holds. No nuclear exchange occurred. The world is damaged, parts of it are ruined, and it is here. It continues.
I want to read one last message. It came in approximately 6 hours ago through the Pacific Relay Network from a student in Busan, South Korea, the improvised capital, the port city that became the last stable point in a peninsula of catastrophe. She says, "I am 20 years old, my family is alive, my city is loud again, in some places and very quiet in others. Yesterday, I walked to the harbor and watched the relief ships come in, and there were people at the dock cheering, which I didn't expect. I stood there and I thought about everything that had happened, and I thought, I don't know what comes next. I genuinely do not know, but I am going to find out. And I think that the finding out, the actual process of rebuilding, is going to require us to be better than we were before. Not better in a vague way, better specifically about how we build systems, about how fast we let them run without our hands on them, about what we owe each other. I'm going to study engineering. I'm going to study what went wrong with the dam structures and the power plants and the automated defense systems. I'm going to spend my life learning how to make things that hold. Her name is Gion, and she is 20 years old, and she is going to study engineering.
To every listener who has been with us throughout this broadcast, we know what you've endured to stay tuned. We know the generators and the batteries and the hand-cranked radios and the relay operators who kept their equipment running through exhaustion and fear. We know that information in the darkest times is a form of companionship. You were not alone while you listened. You were here with us and with each other and with every voice we read to you from around the world.
The work of recovery will take years. It will take decades in the hardest hit places. There will be political reckoning and legal reckoning and moral reckoning, and the Commission in Geneva will be doing its work for a very long time. There will be days ahead that are very hard, and there will be, alongside those days, the things that human beings have always made alongside hardship. Communities and music and meals shared, and children who grow up in the ruins and make something extraordinary from them.
This has been the last broadcast on Emergency Frequency 104.7. I am Daniel Voss.
I am Maya Ross. We have been broadcasting continuously for 30 days. The signal remains live. Keep your radios on. Keep talking to each other. Keep accounting for the dead and caring for the living. The world is smaller and harder than it was 30 days ago, and it is still here. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything.
Stay together. Stay informed. We will continue to broadcast for as long as this signal holds, and then we will find another way to reach you. That is our commitment, and we intend to keep it.
For everyone at the last broadcast, good night, wherever you are. And good morning. It is Against Everything, a new day.